And now we share screen. And I hope you all, oh boy, I gotta move this thing again. I hope you all are seeing a slide that I showed before, 1850 Russia. So Russia aspired to defend the Slavic people and the Christian people. But there's one group that Russia is now defending that's not on this list. And Jim Teisel found and brought up an article, and that let's see, come on. Armenia. So they're Christian. Ramsay's been there recently, and Russia is sort of protecting them. And now that the war with Azerbaijan, which the Azeris won, Russia has peacekeepers there. But the New York Times points out that their peacekeeping role has waned because of what's going on in Ukraine. So there's that. I wanted to throw that. So last time when we stopped in Crimea, it was 2014 invasion. This is the guy who is kind of a gangster type, and he has been the strong hand in Crimea over the last 8 years, and he was just part of the orchestration, the political theater that happened after the Green Men came in. He commanded the Russian troops that were carrying Kalashnikovs. So ever since then, he's reached out. He's tried to modify. I'm not going to spend much time. Then, of course, there was this referendum. Rory Finnan has looked at that with a fine-tooth comb. There was only 30% turnout, and only half of them supported annexation. So but the problem is that it's not the international law that's been condemned by the United Nations. The issue is, what had Crimea done, and was there any neglect of the Tatars? So this is Putin and his henchmen trying to make nice with the Tatars after that invasion. The problem is that over the last 8 years, there's a new reality on the ground. We hear that, of course, in Israel, in the West Bank. Many have fled. New settlers have come in from Russia. It's been almost 10 years since that last survey that I talked about at length last time. So it may be the facts on the ground have changed, and taking Crimea back may be a bridge too far for Ukraine. But a big point that Finnan makes is that Crimean prosperity has always relied on some kind of unity with the steppes, that you needed that hinterland for this peninsula that sticks out in the Black Sea to survive. And we'll see water is part of the problem. And the people that have been involved in the past history of Crimea have noticed that. So even when the Tatars were in charge, they were allied with the Cossacks. And there was kind of a unified step system behind Crimea. We'll see in a second. Potemkin conquered both. Khrushchev, when he restored Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet, not the country, but the Ukrainian Soviet, he reestablished this unity, and they both, with the independence of Ukraine, both Ukraine and Crimea voted for independence. But Ukraine itself was 90% in favor of independence. Crimea was 55%. So there was a discrepancy. Now, the problem is that this unity has been ripped apart by Putin, and he's trying to put it together again. So by the way, Crimea was the capital of Tatar, Crimea, and is the derivation of the term Crimea, comes from Crimean. So this shows the unity that somebody's got their boombox on.
Hi.
So Crimea, Potemkin saw the need for unity, water again, but there was another need, and that was that Khrushchev saw in 1951 when this stamp came out. This is when he said, not only do you need water, which I'll provide with a canal, but you need energy. And here on the stamp is his imagination. This will be the energy grid that'll come from a power station. This is 1951. Construction didn't really start until 57, but this is the canal that was built. So an electric grid and a canal, and this canal fed the grasslands of the high plateau. So agriculture and Tatar farmers were quite skilled because of their long experience on the land. Here's the dam power station. This was the canal as it flowed across the north of Crimea. And this is in 2014, Ukraine, who were really mad about Crimea being taken over by Russia, built a dam and dammed up the canal that Khrushchev had built. And so the canal dried up, the farmland was lost to fertility. And the first thing Russia did within days after invading in 2016 was to blow up that dam and get the water to flow again. Now in Ukraine, there's a heightened awareness of Tatars post-annexation. Now they're trying to make nice. And this is interesting. This is a Tatar woman. She's actually got an Armenian mother, but she won the 2016 Eurovision singing contest, which is a big deal. And the winning song was 1944. You'll remember from last week, that was the year Stalin deported the Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan. And now she's on the Ukrainian stamp as part of the Ukrainian Make Nice with Tatars campaign. Finally, this is the last thing I'm going to say. There's yet another new book. And if you're interested, you can get a preview by listening to the Intelligence Squared podcast that just came on recently. Timothy Snyder had a long piece about developments in what espionage and the FBI and Russian fingers. Timothy Snyder's long piece written, it was really an expose that tied together a lot of strings, is worth a read. But now it's time to travel back to medieval Spain with Ramsay. And
It's a smooth transition.
how's that?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
How's that? We move fast.
Yeah, exactly.
We've only got an hour.
Wait a minute, where are we?
We only got an
If
hour.
it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. What's that?
So I literally pass things on.
Well, let's see if we make this work. My gosh, you're asking for a whole bunch of stuff. Are we?
It should be.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll well, I mean, that's a pretty fast transition. I think the goal, if I understood John's hope over 2 sessions, not just this one, but next, is to try and provide is to get back to Indians in California history, Indians first. And that would require, perhaps, if one's being really diligent, some background into Spanish history, because after all, it was the Spanish who controlled what was considered Northern California until the independence from Spain by Mexico, and then of course it was American. So that'll be a story yet to be told. So the goal was to do a little Spanish background. I took a cue from John from his last time. I said, well, John's taking advantage of this time to throw in a few thoughts about a few tidbits, a few teasers about what's going on in the world. Here's one. This got nothing to do with Spain, but I read this 2 days ago in the New York Times and sort of gulped and said, I know things are not good in Britain, but is this real? That there are estimates that by the end of this year, the average British family will be less well off than a Slavonian one, and by the end of the decade, less well off by a Polish one. Good Lord. Wow. And the argument from the data that this author from the New York Times Magazine quotes is suggests the answer to why that's happening is pretty clear. That for 12 years the Tories have been cutting back on public spending in Britain by substantial amounts, and that austerity is having a nasty effect on the average standard of living of the average British household. So things are up for grabs in good old Britain. Another teaser. This seems to be a common statement these days among many in Europe, that power is shifting east, away from France, Germany, toward Poland, the Balkans, the Baltic countries that are all pushing hard to defend the Ukraine. France and Germany were less easy to bring along. Even the German chancellor has said, yeah, it's true. The center of European power is shifting east. There's no doubt about it. And finally, one more before we turn to Spain. I think a fair number of you may watch Fareed Zakaria on Sunday. Jen and I've become addicted to it. One of the pieces he had last Sunday was to have 3 people talk about, so how are the tanks that are going to come to Ukraine have that big effect on how this war turns out? And there were 2, one Swede, one American, who said, yeah, probably, for sure, it's going to take a little while, a couple months. Whereas this Singaporean diplomat, Kishore Mahbubani, who John and I have followed for years, said, yeah, well, I'm not so sure. If you ask the opinions of me and many of us that sort of represent the 85% of the world that's not not willing to impose sanctions on Russia, our sense is that Russia is not being hurt that bad economically, and that the tanks will have some little effect, but probably in the end of the day, there's going to have to be a political compromise. And he went on to say, look, you can't blame India for being neutral. Modi has made it very clear that he thinks what Russia's doing is bad, but he's not going to put sanctions on India. The relationship between India and Russia is long. Down in the bottom paragraph in purple, he says, look, for decades now, India has depended on the Russian veto in the Security Council to protect Indian interests. He said, there's no way in hell that the American, French, and British veto was going to help China either. And that link between India and Russia has been useful, and India is not going to break it, especially when India feels on top of the world these days for economic growth and this and that. Teasers, little teasers for things to think about as this and that comes up. But Spain, no, heck with that. I don't want to go past this. Whether you find this useful or not is your choice to make. But I thought we got one shot at this. Let's go way back for Spain, and there's also the possible also interest in saying, this whole notion of who belongs and who owns this territory and who's been there forever and what the history is. There's other places in the world where people have come and gone, and ethnicities have changed, and even religions have changed. It keeps some context in the Ukraine. If we go way back before even the Romans have taken over Spain, to a linguistic map of what's the Iberian Peninsula, it was complicated as could be. I mean, you had some Indo-European languages that sort of dominated here and there. In the green, you've got the precursors to Basque, which is a language isolate. There's no language in the world that's connected to the Basque language. Where that came from, DNA would have to work out for us. Then in the turquoise down across from the Gibraltar Straits, another language that was not connected to the Indo-European family. So this was mighty complicated as far as who was there as the Romans arrived. Rome is going to take over that whole area around the Mediterranean Sea. This is a map of, this is a map of the Roman Empire divided into 4 different units just before the Roman Empire finally fell apart. And so that history doesn't matter too much, but Rome, of course, is going to have some influence in Spain and send some Latin, more Latin speaking into Spain. Then Rome falls apart. The Visigoths, the Goths of all sorts of flavors, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, etc., are all going to sort of work their way into the Roman Empire. Not that there are huge numbers of people, but they will have a huge effect on history as time passes. The Visigoths, and the term Visigoth means Western Goths, and the Visigoths in that light purple that you can see eventually showing up in Spain will end up west. The story of Adrianople over there near the Bosporus is interesting. The Goths were screaming to the Romans, look, you've got to let us into the empire. We're going to be slaughtered. We're going to be slaughtered by, whom were they going to be slaughtered by? By the Huns. And the Huns are nasty. They're tougher than us. Let us in, please. Finally, the Roman Empire was willing to say, all right, come on in, and then did nothing to help out the Visigoths, who were more or less starving. So the Visigoths attacked the Roman Empire stronghold, Adrianople, in 387, won a battle, moved on to Rome, sacked Rome in 410, but they were relatively weak themselves and got pushed toward what is now Iberia, where they settled. And so there was a Visigoth entry into who are the people, what's the DNA that's going to settle in what we now call Spain. There's a map, the light orange up in the northwest. Well, the dark red, the darkish red, is where the Visigoths had originally settled, but they were pushed out by other Goths, the Burgundians, the Franks, and eventually settled in what's now Spain. And we're a serious 200-year, 300-year presence in Spain before, and they converted to Christianity, start building some churches, pretty rudimentary as compared to what's going to come from the Muslims that will show up in Spain in short order here, but they were Christian. Then 7-Eleven, the year 7-Eleven, easy to remember because we go shop at 7-Eleven for whatever we need. Where the Visigothic king, as Roderick is getting his army prepared to try and defeat the invading army that's going to come across the straits from North Africa, led by a Moorish commander. He himself was not Arab. He was Berber, Jabal Tariq ibn Zia, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. That's where the word Gibraltar comes from. The name Gibraltar comes from this Moorish Berber commander that's going to lead the Muslim people, less Arabs, more Berbers that will cross in 711, and so they will take over Spain. And there's the high point of this invading force that crosses the Gibraltar Strait and takes over almost all of what we call Iberia these days. Eventually, they're stopped in Tours or Toulouse, but they get pretty far. The Umayyads themselves is an interesting story. The Umayyads were the second caliphate of the Muslim caliphates that evolved after Muhammad. Muhammad's family was the first. The Umayyads are second. By the time you get to 720s, even earlier than that, the Umayyads were on the run. They were not liked by the people that they ruled, non-Umayyad Arab tribes themselves, Persians, as the Umayyads moved further east. And there was a real revolt against the Umayyad Caliphate. And the wise Umayyads said, we're eventually going to lose. Let's get the hell out of here. Fled across North Africa and got as far as they could. And they got as far as Spain, obviously, or what we call Spain.
And they were the ones who said the descendants of Muhammad should rule, right? And that's the Shia split and the Shia lost.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
Okay.
that came even earlier. That split came during the Umayyad Caliphate. That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. But it's a little more complicated about who said what, and that's a different sort of history. But here, so you have a losing Arab caliphate on the run, and they eventually settle in what we call Iberia. And by 750, they've lost. And the control, the theoretic control of the Islamic world, or the political leadership and the religious leadership combined, now will switch to the Abbasid Caliphate, located not in Damascus, where the Umayyads were, but Baghdad. That's all Islamic history. All we need to focus on for Iberia is the Umayyads are there, and they settle in and will rule with some impressive effect for some time. They will have control at least part of the Iberian Peninsula right up until the famous year of 1492, but the Christians will slowly push back. And if you watch that Day the Universe Changed show, then you're already familiar with this whole notion that the Islamic world was way ahead of Christians in terms of holding on to learning from the Greeks and Romans, from wherever else it appeared, including the Islamic world itself. So this long period up to 1492. One of the greatest libraries in the world, not just in Muslim Spain, was in the city of Córdoba. There are very explicit expectations in the Quran that rulers are supposed to support and subsidize learning and pay for libraries and make sure that learning is included. Everyone that is Muslim is supposed to learn to read the Quran, and that was a big deal. So there's a whole bunch of information here that's not necessarily all that important, just making the point that the library in Cordoba was enormous. It starts very early under the fourth ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate in Andalusia. Andalusia is the name of the Spanish, the name the Spanish used. I mean, the Muslims used for calling Spain what we call today Spain. A huge library with as many as perhaps 400,000 books at its height, when the biggest libraries in Europe at best had 100, maybe less. So it's a huge library, but just because Muslims and the Umayyad Caliphate ancestries are ruling, they're going to run into some bad times themselves, internal fighting for who's going to be the next ruler, this and that. Bad times after 1000, the library in Córdoba was sacked. Many of the books disappeared or moved on to somewhere else. One of those somewhere else's was Toledo. And again, if you watch the Day the Universe Changed segment, it was in Toledo that James Burke shows that little segment where rather ignorant monks coming across from Europe are learning about their own history. The Córdoba library will eventually completely disappear, burned and destroyed by Ferdinand and Isabella once they control that area. I assume a fair number of you have traveled or maybe consider traveling. Do it someday if you haven't. Time is running short, guys. We're getting real old. There's the great Mosque of Córdoba. It's stunning. It's huge. There's all sorts of things to see there. If you get to Córdoba, you'll surely go to the Great Mosque. It was one of the great cities. So there's a map in 1030 of the Iberian Peninsula, mostly dominated by Islam. But after 1030, things are going to get, the Christians will be on a bit of a roll. And by, I think it's 1080, Toledo will have changed hands and will become Christian. But before we get there, some explanation of what was happening, as happens in any long reign of one group, in this case, Muslims. Things fall apart, corruption occurs, internal fighting happens. In Spanish history and in Islamic history, for that matter, there was an era called taifas. Taifa simply means factions or camps, when instead of unification and a single ruler controlling most of the area, it would fall apart into smaller areas. That's exactly what happened around 1031. It would happen several other times in this Muslim-dominated part of Spain. And under those circumstances, Christians were able to make substantial gains. And when I say Christians, I should be careful. There was never, even up to the last moment, a unified Christian push to take over Spain. It was always one rule, one Christian family, the Castilla family, the Leons, the Navarrans, all these different Christian kings and Christian crusaders, and they fought each other more than they fought Muslims. So it wasn't like there was some unified Christian push until the very, very end, kind of controlled by the Pope. But if you look at a complementary map to the one that I showed once before, by 1220, Toledo has fallen. Toledo has now been taken over by Castillo, and James Burke made the point that it really wasn't a military victory. It was rather a calculated surrender by the Muslims living in Toledo to say, this guy's a pretty good guy. We're going to maintain control, but there won't be punishment of Muslims. We'll just surrender and be vassals to the Castilla king. And so it was. There was a point to be made over and over by historians is, look, this reconquest that went on for hundreds of years was a very slow process. There's a map there of the various years in which various cities was taken over. It was slow. What are the reasons why it was so slow? And most of that time, while the Reconquista was going on, the cooperation and tolerance among Muslims, Christians, and Jews was quite substantial. And this was a tolerant community, Christians, as was the case in most of the Muslim world. Christians and Jews were not completely equal to Muslims, but they were allowed to worship as they wished. They had to pay a slightly higher tax than Muslims, but in that, otherwise, there was a great deal of tolerance going on. So there was that aspect.
The people of the book.
The people of the book. People of the book. If you weren't people of the book being back to Moses, Christianity, Quran, all of them people of a single monotheistic religion to some degree. Another factor was that the Christians spent more time fighting each other, and Muslims did the same. And the third factor that creates a slow moving rolling process is that most of the fighting was done by mercenaries. And those mercenaries, of course, switched sides all the time. Whoever paid them better, they switched sides. El Cid was named as one of those kind of I fight for money people. There's Toledo. Again, if you've not been to Spain and time is limited, go. Toledo is a stunning city, especially when you see it from this point of view. This is just a picture, a photograph off the internet. Any tourist that goes there will see this before they enter Toledo. A very famous painter who had moved from Greece to Toledo to spend the rest of his life painted a scene of that. He paints a scene that's off to the west, off to the right of this picture. Some of you are well familiar with this. I remember being in elementary school and seeing this, thinking, where is that? This who's the painter? Who paints this? Famous El Greco, who spent most of his life painting scenes of Christian scenes in Toledo. This slide simply makes the point. It's a lecture from the guy that wrote the book, The Vanished World, saying the 12th century, but a time when Christians have taken control of Toledo, was probably the greatest age of Christian, Muslim, Jewish cooperation in Toledo. Libraries were not pillaged, they weren't burned. It's a time when monks from the West came across the mountains with the rumor that there were things to learn here in Toledo. You saw, to repeat again, the scene that James Burke reproduced for TV viewers of the Christian monks sitting there saying, well, I can't read Latin. I can't read, I can read Latin. That's all I can. You Muslims, you can read Latin. You can read Arabic. You can read Greek. Would you please translate this for me?
He was talking to a Jew.
He was talking to a Jew.
Who was translating.
Yeah, to a Jew is translating. Say, thank you. I'm sorry. Someone watched the video better than me. I was probably watching the Warriors game or whatever. This scared to death about the fourth quarter, but never mind. And let's not talk about the 49ers.
Is that El Greco is called El Greco? The Greek.
He's Greek. He was Greek. He came to Spain for obvious reasons. The Ottomans were taking over where he left. And so if you want to, I'm overdoing it, I suppose, but there was this moment, James Burke's being very clever, where the Jew that's translating Arabic text from Greek, from here and there, says, well, and this calculation, here's the numbers, 1, 2, 3, whatever, 0. And the monk from Europe says, what's 0? We've never heard of 0. What is 0? And how do I write 0? Making the point that the Europeans that late in the 12th century still had not gotten the concept of 0. And if without the concept of 0, your math, even if what is devoted to wonderful secular learning purely to learn, or whether it's devoted to military warfare, is going nowhere until you had the concept of 0, which finally came to Europe, thankful because of the arrival of some monks in Toledo and yada, yada, yada.
I love the way that ended with the Jewish translator just kind of rolling it aside. So just leave it blank.
Yeah, you don't know how to write it, just leave it blank. Just leave a hole. And whatever. I'm not going through all of this. This is if you are to I do it all the time in the Mideast in preparation for John and Michael and Janet and me and everybody else. It seems like half people we know are going to the Middle East this summer. That's great. But there is an unbelievable list of scholars that came out of the Islamic world that contributed to stuff that matters to us. Here's a small list of some of those that lived in Islamic Spain, the Andalusia, and medicine. Above all the sciences, medicine was probably the biggest contributor from these Muslim scholars living in Spain at the time, what we call Spain. But astronomy, agronomy, all the ability of Spain to produce good harvest was a gift of Islamic irrigation technology brought across the Gibraltar Straits. Yada yada. Yeah, the Romans had done that too, but most of the irrigation that allowed Andalusia to thrive came from Islamic irrigation systems. Things, I'm going to throw this in. This may be irritating to you. I'm going to throw it in because Janet and I were in Morocco last year, but it does matter, I think, to some degree regarding the history of Spain before Spain became the dominant force in the Americas, eventually affecting American Indians. There was a moment when things were really bad for those Muslims living in what we call Spain. And they sent a plea to the latest dynasty now ruling in Morocco, the Almoravid dynasty, who had just come to power in 1050. They came into power because they dominated the gold trade coming from West Africa. We would call it Timbuktu and so forth. They were powerful, and this call went out to these Muslims in Morocco, please cross the Gibraltar Straits and save us from Christians, and so they did. But of course, having saved the now relatively corrupt leaders of Andalusia from Christians, the Almoravids stayed on and ruled themselves for some period of time. And they themselves were then replaced by yet another Moroccan dynasty, the Almohads, who ruled for about 100 years, coming from Morocco themselves. And these guys were able to push back on the Christian conquest and reconquer Seville and Córdoba and various other places. They maintained their capital in Marrakesh. It's all somewhat significant if you've ever visited Spain, because you will of course go to Sevilla. Well, Sevilla was their capital, the capital of these Moors. One of the places they rebuilt when they reconquered Sevilla was the Alcazar. And if you've ever been to Sevilla, you have surely been to the Alcazar. If you've never been to Sevilla, you've at least seen this picture. I know you've seen this picture because it's from a famous film where the director said, well, we're not going to film in Cairo. We'll find some pictures that look exactly like Cairo must have looked like. And we'll just film in Spain for these scenes from his famous movie. And what is that movie? Who's that guy dressed in Arab gear here? And what's the scene going on? A scene this is Lawrence of Arabia. And there's Peter O'Toole, fresh out of the desert, crossing the Sinai. And he's going to go in and speak theoretically in Cairo with his British commanders and say, I need guns, I need money to go back and fight in World War I. Other things that were built by the Almohads. If you've been to Spain, you've seen the gigantic, what was then a minaret. It was built by the Almohads, called the Giralda. If you go to Seville these days, it's now been incorporated into a Christian church, naturally, taken over by Christians. If you then ever get the luck to go to Marrakesh, or been to Marrakesh, you see almost exactly the same minaret, built by the same Moroccans at the same time. And there's a 16th century picture of Seville, and you can see that gigantic minaret still standing out, now surrounded by a Christian church, incorporated into a Christian church. But the Christians didn't knock it down. It was too glorious to do so. And Jan and I were there in Morocco last year. The name of that, or the Calif, or the ruler in Andalusia who had that minaret built, was a guy named Ben Yosef. And there's a madras in Marrakesh named after him. I mean, Jen and I walked into these places in Morocco and just sort of shook our head at the glory, the gorgeousness of these the stunning architecture. Of course, Islam does not allow depiction of human figures or any other living figure. So it's all got to be geometric design. But this was some of the culture that Spain was gifted from its time in of being ruled by Muslims and so forth and so forth. Madrasas, of course, have got a bad name for us because they are schools in Islam, and they are all, the connotation is all madrasas do nothing but teach extreme Islamic nonsense, and that was not the case whatsoever with these madrasas back in the day, although that may be the case with madrasas built by the Saudi Arabians these days. In any case, the Reconquista gathered steam after 1212 for interesting reasons. And the reasons were there was going to be yet another invasion across, well, there was not going to be, there was another invasion of Andalusia across the Straits of Gibraltar to push back on on Christian gains, in fact, to reconquer some of that territory by Christians. And at this stage, by 1212, the Crusades, the Pope inspired Crusades to reconquer the Holy Lands is pretty much over. And so the Pope is turning his attention to, how about Spain? Let's focus on reconquering Spain, because we're going to fail we already have failed more or less in the Holy Lands. And for a brief moment, he is able to get these feuding Christian kingdoms, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, to put aside the differences and actually fight back against the Almohads, who were defeated in 1212. And then the Christians push on rather effectively, conquer Córdoba, Seville, etc. And so by 1248, there's not much left in Spain that Muslims dominate, except the little sliver of Granada at the very bottom. And even then, the next dynasty that will rule in Morocco, the Marinids, who are pretty famous, are able to produce enough defense of Granada so it will thrive itself for another 200 years. So there's still Granada left to conquer. And there's not much left of Andalusia in Spain, but there is Granada, and it's going to take another 200 years. Same deal. If you've been to Spain, if you haven't considered this the third or fourth entreaty, to please go have a visit before you can't visit anymore. You got to go to Alhambra sometime in your life, and you will be blown away, I think, like all of us are, at the glory of the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, and how beautiful the place is. Gardens, when the fountains are turned on, and you've got water fountains all over the place here. Just at the end of this pool is where the leader would have lived. This design, even on a 110-degree day, keeps the place cool to about 70 degrees. Clever design of winds, guards all over the place. But the time was now against Spain. What's going on in the world that's going to put time against Spain and against Islam itself? The Mongols are now, by this time, have sacked Baghdad. So the Abbasid Caliphate falls apart and will never be put back together. So there's real disunity in the Islamic world for a while. The Ninth Crusade by 1271, the very last crusade, has failed. All the attention of the Pope is going to switch to Spain. The Ottomans are coming on as a power in Europe, in Anatolia. They have not conquered Constantinople yet, but they're getting close. This scares the hell out of Christians. There's a real fear of the Muslim world getting more powerful, not less powerful. The Mongol peace that will follow after the horrors of Mongol destruction will allow all this useful military technology to finally make it to Europe. Gunpowder and all those sorts of stuff. Renaissance math, which was a great gift to Islamic Spain, gets pretty good at taking advantage of some of the technology the military technology that works its way from China to Europe to expand on it. The Mongol peace will also bring the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, as we've talked about in other areas, some of you are well aware of this because we did that, is going to have, curiously, after devastating death, a very positive effect on Europe's economic growth because of the rapid social mobility that will inspire, because there's so many dead, there's so much room open with all these dead people. Economic growth is moving faster in Europe at the end of the bubonic plague period. Land hunger is rife, and some of that land is available, and the little bit that's left is Spain to conquer. So you have this a real set of characters here that's been building in Spain for some period of time. Becomes apparently, this was new to me when I was sort of looking this out. The Castile particularly, this is going to be where Isabel is going to be queen. Castile in particular produces some real nasty people that were famous or infamous for their devotion to their love of battle, the quest. But the quest is a little different from earlier quest. There's a quote down below from a historian that these Castilian men were notoriously tough, arrogant, quick to take offense, love danger and hardship, and suffer, and so forth and so forth. This is exactly the set of characters that's going to go off to the New World after Columbus opens the door. They're land hungry. Now, many of them are the second sons of royalty. In other words, they don't inherit anything, and off they will go. And so, just to make a point, I think some of you're surely, everyone's aware of Don Quixote, whether you've read it or not, but it focuses on this lovable character, Don Quixote, who's sort of painted as a kind of pathetic because he doesn't realize what's happened in the world. He's on a moral quest. And that's the whole point of Cervantes' book, is that when Cervantes writes the 2 volumes of Don Quixote, 1605, 1615, and Don Quixote and his sidekick, Sancho Panza. Sancho are kind of silly characters. They're tilting at windmills. Says that whole idea of a moral knightly quest, that's over, man. Don't you get it? The quest of conquistadors, so Cervantes is making the point, is about land and wealth and power. And that's the characters that are going to show up in the New World, not get as far as California quite yet. You got to go through centuries of that for next week. But Cortez, Pizarro, those characters are poster boys for these characters. These pretty nasty characters. So to finish back in Spain, 1469, Isabella and Ferdinand are married. Their 2 kingdoms are now going to be more or less united. And those 2 kingdoms are not just part of Spain, because Castilla is huge, but Aragon, that is Ferdinand, is also controls southern Spain, southern Italy. And I got a white dot there where Rome is. It's worth noting that while in theory the Pope was ruling an independent Rome with the Vatican and all that, really he was completely dependent on Spanish power to stay independent, and that was going to matter when you get to wars of religion after the Reformation. We'll talk about next time. So after getting married, Ferdinand and Isabella create the Spanish Inquisition, which basically means they will take over control of the Inquisition from the Pope and control it themselves. In theory, the Inquisition is intended to root out heretics, not just among Jews and Christian and Muslims, but Christian heretics as well. And there were plenty of them that say, we're Christians and we're real Christians. And what we're getting out of Rome is a bunch of hogwash. Those people were killed. The Jews who faked and Muslims who faked the conversion to Catholicism were supposed to be rooted out. Of course, over time, the Inquisition is used not just for that, but it's used to maintain really rather Stalin-like control of the Spanish Empire. And it's noted down below The Inquisition is not ended until 1834. Thank you very much, Pope. I mean, how sort of pathetic. In theory, the reconquest of Iberia is mostly, it's conquering Muslims, but it also takes on a very serious anti-Semitic tone fairly early. And this is, I think, is not new to anybody. 13th, 14th century, England and France has expelled its Jewish populations. The reconquest of Spain becomes seriously anti-Semitic as well as anti-Muslim. Persecution of Jews is as serious as Muslims, maybe even more serious. I've already done that. What's going on here? 1492, it's finally done. The Ferdinand and Isabella's forces with mercenaries and everybody else has finally conquered Granada. The Alhambra decree is ordered. It's interesting that it's not focused on Muslims, it's focused on Jews. All Jews out by July. And it's estimated that if the 300,000 Jews then living in Spain, who had been more than tolerated, had been accepted as important parts of our mercantile community, our learning community for a substantial period of time in 700 years in Spain, are now told convert or get out. It's estimated that 200,000 had converted. Now they won't be judged down the road as honest converters, but that's a pretty tough thing to take. Another note down the bottom here. In 1968, the Vatican says, "We're sorry, we apologize. We shouldn't have done that. It was kind of nasty." Too late, guys. Too late. Too late. In contrast, in 1492, instead of being kicked out, Muslims were treated fairly well, but only briefly, only for about 7 years. They could immigrate immigrate to Morocco and turn around and come back. They weren't forced to change religion. But 7 years later, Castile starts to revoke some of that tolerance, and led by Archbishop Cisneros. There's got to be conversion. If you don't convert, you're out. All sorts of burning of manuscripts. The Inquisition is strengthened. Moors will rebel, of course, and the rebellion makes it even worse for them. And pretty soon, Muslims are told, you got to leave too. And the famous date is 1609. And this will have an effect in the history of Morocco as well. So between 1609 and 1614, all converted Muslims, we don't trust you. We don't think you've really converted. You're all out. Something like 300,000 are sent off to, well, frankly, they're exported to Morocco, and that will have some interesting effect. A few were able to survive. Some able to come back. Columbus, it's 1492 after all. We should talk about Columbus. Columbus had been walking from going from one royal family in Europe to another, saying, come on, I've got this great idea. If I'm right, you're going to make a ton of money. He'd been negotiating for 7 years off and on with the Spaniards. Here he is not in, well, I think the point was made that when once Granada is conquered, Ferdinand and Isabella move into the Alhambra to take over as a castle. This wonderful Muslim thing that you can go visit now. But in 1485 they were still up in Segovia, which is just north of Madrid. Also a wonderful place that you have to visit if you haven't ever visited Spain. Talk to me, I'll arrange a trip for you. And so here he is in 1485. And most of the advisors to Ferdinand and Isabella say he's nuts. This is not going to work. But finally in 1492, and the rumor, there's some possibility that one of the advisors might have said, you know, what if he's right? If he's right, this will be a bonanza. And he's not asking for all that much money anyway. And so in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella will say, yeah, okay, we'll fund your trip. He's made a terrible mistake. He doesn't know he's made a mistake. These are not the globes he had, but it makes the point. He's carrying with him a globe which is half the size of what it really was. And if you've got a globe that's half the size of really what's of the accurate thing, then of course you're going to think you're right, because by 1492 there was a pretty good sense of how far it was from Spain to India and to China. I mean, the people had been going back and forth since Vasco da Gama, or at least had some sense of that. And you have all these Muslim texts that give you information about that. But if you have a globe which is half the size and calculate how far it is from Spain to China and India with the accurate information that Islam had, then the distance from Spain to India going west was much, much shorter. Of course, that's wrong because he had a globe which is half the size, but he talked over into it. To 1492, he sets off. Everyone knows this. You don't necessarily know when he left. He left August 3rd from Seville. There's a picture, not a real honest picture, but a picture of Isabella and Ferdinand seeing him off. He'll arrive in October 12th. It's somewhere in perhaps the Dominican Republic or somewhere clear nearby. He's going to claim the territory for Spain. He thinks he's in India, of course. We all know this. We've heard this 1,000 times. He would claim it not just for Spain, but Christianity. John?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, we're about done. We're just about done. So we're so all of what we'll talk about next time, and many of you know this because it's sort of standard history. Spain will not only send conquistadores over there to get gold and silver, but they'll also send missionaries galore. For a long period of time, they're obsessed with Christianity. These guys didn't come for Christianity. These are the Cortez and Pizarro and this early conquistador crowd were land-hungry thugs. I mean, they were thugs. They would have been happy to sign up for the thugs that the Wagner group and so forth is sending into the Ukraine. I mean, but for a whole series of circumstances, they win. Cortez against the Aztecs in 1520, Pizarro against the Incas in 1532. By the time you get to, he's better known as Charles V rather than Charles I. He's both Charles I, the Habsburg King of Spain, but he's also at the same time Charles V, the fifth Charles, Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, look at the territory that he controls, not just what he controls from Spain, that is Spain and Naples, but also the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. He had his wealth to bribe his way into being elected as Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, he is by far the richest monarch in Europe, scaring the hell out of poor old France. Why is he so wealthy? Well, because of this. Not just this one mountain. We've talked about this before, and those of you that have been around, but this one mountain, which is at almost 16,000 feet in what's now Bolivia, then Peru, is rich beyond belief. It's going to be named eventually Potosi, going to be mined by slaves and by Indians who are not allowed to be slaves, but they're going to work there anyway. Many will die. From 1545 onward, this single mountain will produce 60% of most of the gold, most of the silver in the whole world for the second half of the 16th century. Eventually, the silver mines of Mexico will produce even more, but it continues on. The estimate of the number of workers, slaves, or Indians that there will die mining there is probably somewhere between 2.5 to 3 million, but Spain will become rich. And for a while, the city is the fourth largest Christian city in the world, bigger than London and Milan and Seville because it's so rich. If John sends out a video, here's a YouTube 8-minute video, which is just wonderful on why the connection between Spanish silver and Britain fighting the war against China in 1900. Here's us. Jen and I get to do this too. Here's some of us in Bolivia saying, yeah, we'd like to do the mine tour. Let's see if we can hold. I scared out of my headlight did not work. I almost fell into that hole, and God knows where I would have ended up. Yeah, and we also had a tour of the mint, the Spanish mint in Potosi, and that's interesting because on the mint is stamped Potosi, PSI, and it's possible that if you subtract the P over on the left, on the right, that this is where we get the dollar bill sign for the for US dollars. In fact, that's the best guess of where it comes from. Spain is going to have these. I know I'm just about out of time. We're almost done anyway. Spain's got these treasure fleets coming back from Mexico and Peru once a year. First it's 17 ships, then it's 50. They come back to Spain loaded with incredible amounts of bullion. And do I have a minute here left, John? I think I got 1 minute left.
Okay.
From our visit to Morocco last year, we learned this. Here's a guy, a Dutchman. The Dutch were united with Muslims against Spain because, after all, the Dutch were probably trying to become independent from Spain, and Muslims were more than happy to fight Spain too. These are Ottoman Muslims. This guy goes off to the Mediterranean. He eventually converts to Islam. He accumulates 17 what we would call pirate ships. He sails to what's now Morocco. He is elected by the Moroccan pirates themselves to be their leader, and all the Moroccans know him quite well. And when we walk through Rabat, it's now called, back then it was called Saleh. When we walk through what's now called Rabat, we walk past this town, the old town. Most of this glorious buildings that we saw were built by very rich Muslims who knew in 1609 they were going to be thrown out of Spain, so they moved here themselves. Moroccan, they created an impressive pirate force, but these were not people. These are not the Barbary pirates. In fact, these guys, their ancestors at any rate, were the very first country to recognize the United States when it became independent from Britain. And that's more information that you ever wanted to know. But so next time, the goal will be to bring this way too rapid little review back to the New World and get the Spanish up to Mexico. But it'll require some talk about the Reformation and this interesting character, Bartolome de las Casas. Some of you know him anyway. If not, you'll be prepared next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Yeah, he'll be big in California. De
Las Casas is big, and you can go visit his city in Mexico. So yeah, very good, very good. So the goal next time is to slow down and talk with more detail about the Spanish mentality as Spanish conquistadores are working their way north into Colorado and eventually California, although they come more as padres.
Questions, comments?
Aiko's got a question.
Is it unsurprising that Spain perhaps went to the New World because they had all of that word of knowledge sitting there and
The question is did was Spain willing to go to the New World because of they had Arab knowledge or Muslim knowledge? No, they didn't. But there is the possibility that one of the I learned this. I looked it up. I couldn't have any confirmation. It's a myth, I think, but still, it's been repeated in TV shows that one of the advisors to Ferdinand and Isabella said, "What if he's right?" I mean, Columbus had actually left Spain and was halfway to France, and they said, "Go run after him. Go as fast as you can. Bring him back. What if he's right?" And it turns out that you can't get to India that way. And of course, we all know this, that it changed the world. And the fact that Spain got there first made a whole hell of a lot of difference.
If you go out to the end of Cape Cod, the province town, which is a Portuguese city, it won't take long to encounter a Portuguese who will tell you that Portuguese fishermen were in America way before Columbus, fishing off the Great Banks.
Are you talking about Cape Cod or
At Cape Cod,
Oh,
at the end of Cape Cod, and that a good fisherman never, if he's found a good fishing hole, never tells about it. So they didn't brag about it, but they were there, and in fact, Portuguese were standing in Provincetown looking north of the bay when the Mayflower sailed in, and they said, "There goes the neighborhood."
Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, the answer to your question, obviously, the real issue is that Spain and Portugal were on the Atlantic seaboard, and they had the first shot of sailing down the Atlantic to see if they could find their way around Africa. And that's all connected to 1453 when the Ottomans take over Constantinople. And so there's but it does matter that these rabid Christians, Catholic Christians, get there first, as opposed to the Protestant crowd that shows up in New England.
Example, the Muslim knowledge of sailing.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. The ability for Portuguese and Spanish to sail down the coast of Africa was borrowed from the ability to have the sails that they borrowed from the Arabs that had learned to sail across the Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean to get to India. There's 700 years of that. And astrolabes and all that stuff, but yeah, so we inherited a whole bunch of this and that, and claim it was all because of corporations that we got rich.
But I mean, like
Iko's asking questions. Anyone wants to butt in?
but he's worried about battery on the computer. Oh, I forgot what I was going to ask now. Never mind.
Anybody else? Iko's forgotten. Iko,
Perhaps his memory.
if you have, I'm going to say it for the 5th time. If you haven't gone to see in Spain, and you good Lord, you've got to go there. It's spectacular. Okay, people are saying goodbye. So,
well, this is Carol. This was a spectacular presentation. So I'm looking forward to watching it a second time and slowing things down because Ramsay goes so fast.
yeah,
There's so much information.
There's a lot of stuff. Yeah, that's why John's taping is clever. Think, Carol, consider when you get to one of those last slides. There's that YouTube reference that I had, where some Brit says in 8 minutes, if you don't know the connection between Spanish silver and the British war, the British opium wars, I'll tell you. And for 8 minutes, he explains it. It's quite clever.
That would be great because I don't know that. Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ramsay.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Brad.
Ramsay. Excellent, excellent. And see you next week.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Ramsay.
Thank you, Ramsay.
Oh, by the way, John is as healthy as a horse, and we won't mention why.
Muslims get credit in Spain for all.
They didn't through all the way through Franco, but now it's I think it's there's enormous pride, and if you visit these Muslim sites, if you had the right guide, and I think most of them are right.
But you mean
The Alhambra, the Cordoba Mosque.
yeah.
If you go into the huge church there in Seville, the guides will say, most of this is built, at least this huge tower that we have a cross on top of, that was built by Islam.
Yeah.
And it's and we're there's a generation now that's hoping that it might be possible. I mean, an educated generation. It's never everybody, of course,
Yeah.
never. that over time, Spain could somehow reconstruct the tolerance, be a model for the tolerance, the learning that was multi-ethnic, multicultural, and they have a sense of pride about that, as opposed to we're one of the, up until very recently, the 1970s, we were one of the poor countries in Europe and needed subsidy from the EU to get on with it. But they've got the same problems everybody else does in Europe. Low birth rates,
Older
people,
yeah.
a part of the population which claims that all these immigrant laborers are taking away jobs. And I suppose there's some small point to that, but you say, you want to, what we heard, well, when we were in Morocco and walking through one of the villages there up in the Atlas Mountains, our incredibly wise guy said, you won't see any young people here because they're all working in Spain right now. And they will be home for 1 month. They're working in Spain and Portugal. They're working all over Europe, but primarily in Spain and Portugal, picking crops, of course. And it's exactly the same as here in California. Well, and we saw the pictures of it last week, where this nutcase killed 5 of his, or 6 or 7 of his co-workers. But then you saw but then you saw the hovels that these poor people are living in. No heat, an outdoor toilet, rain coming in. There's and we allow that to happen. So that we can get cheap celery and cheap this and that and so forth. You say, come on, man, are we civilized or not? And the answer is only semi.
There's one celery left.
Where were we when we saw that candy cane church in Europe? Remember when we were at that last